A few years ago, if you'd have told me I would be 55 years old, single, rebuilding my life from scratch, and actually okay with staying that way, I honestly wouldn't have believed you. Because for most of my life, I thought um, that relationships were the goal. You know, you meet somebody, you commit, you fight for it, you sacrifice, you keep showing up no matter what. That's what I believed. And honestly, I probably believed it just a little too much. Because somewhere along the way, especially in my marriage, I stopped asking whether the relationship was healthy and started believing that my job was just to hold it all together no matter what it cost me. And that mindset, almost destroyed me, and not all at once. In my case, it was narcissistic abuse. I just didn't have a name for it back then. I only knew that over the years I was becoming somebody that I didn't even recognize anymore. Maybe for somebody else it was emotional neglect or constant criticism, walking on eggshells, or just feeling invisible in their own relationship. But whatever the cause, it happens little by little. You stop speaking up as much, you stop relaxing, you start explaining yourself constantly. You second guess your own reactions. You second guess even your own thoughts. You start trying to prevent problems before they even happen. And after enough years of living like that, you don't even recognize yourself anymore. That's the part that hit me the hardest afterwards. Not losing the marriage, but losing myself. And I think people who haven't gone through something like that sometimes misunderstand why people like me end up choosing peace over another relationship later in life. They think you're bitter or maybe angry or selfish, but honestly, for me, it's none of those. It's really none of those things. I don't hate relationships. I know healthy relationships exist. I know there's good women in the world. This isn't me saying love is fake or nobody should get married. That's not what this is. This is me finally understanding what it cost me to abandon myself for years, trying to save something that was slowly destroying me. Once you finally get out of that kind of environment, peace starts feeling different. Not exciting, not dramatic, just safe. And if you've lived for years walking on eggshells, safe becomes priceless. That's something that I never understood before. I used to think peace sounded boring, but now I protect it with everything I have. And I think that's why being single at this stage of life doesn't scare me the way people think it should. Because I'm not sitting around miserable every day thinking that, nobody wants me. Honestly, for the first time in a long time, I can actually hear myself think. There's no tension in the house. There's no emotional landmines. There's, no trying to figure out what mood somebody's in before you walk into a room. There's no constant pressure to prove you're enough. And if you've ever lived through that kind of relationship, it's hard to explain how exhausting that becomes over time, especially for men. because a lot of men are taught to just tolerate it, push through it, handle it, stay quiet, work harder, be stronger. So that's what you do until one day you wake up and realize you've spent years surviving instead of living. That realization hit me hard after everything fell apart. And when I say everything, I mean everything. My entire life changed financially, emotionally, mentally. There were moments that I honestly didn't recognize my own life anymore. And wasn't entirely sure I wanted to live it at all. And I think something happens to you after you rebuild from the ground up. You become a whole lot more careful about what you allow into your peace. Because when you've had to rebuild yourself once or more than that, even, you realize how much damage the wrong person can do. And that changes you. And I know some people hear that and think immediately, well, that just means you haven't healed. Well, maybe. But I also think that there's wisdom that comes from surviving something painful. Not every wall is bitterness. Sometimes it's experience. Sometimes it's finally learning your own limits. And honestly, I think part of getting older is realizing you don't have to force yourself into situations that no longer feel right just because society expects it. There's so much pressure around relationships, especially at my age. People act like if you're single over 50 that something must be wrong. Like happiness only counts if another person validates it. And I just don't believe that anymore. Because some of the loneliest moments of my life happened while I was married. That's another thing that people don't talk about enough. You can feel completely alone sitting right next to somebody else every day. Actually, sometimes that kind of loneliness is even worse. Because when you're physically alone, at least there's honesty in it. But being emotionally abandoned inside of a relationship, that does something to a person. And I think that's why my perspective has changed so much. Now, when I think about a relationship, I don't think, would this make me happy? I think, would this cost me my peace? That's a completely different mindset. And maybe some people won't understand, unless they've lived through it themselves. But after narcissistic abuse, your nervous system changes. You stop craving intensity, you stop romanticizing chaos, and you stop confusing emotional exhaustion with passion. And for the first time in your life, calm actually feels attractive. And that's where I'm at now. I'm not chasing excitement anymore. I'm not trying to prove I'm lovable anymore. I'm not trying to rescue anybody. And I'm not trying to earn basic respect. I just want honesty, peace, and stability. Freedom to be myself. And if that exists naturally someday with somebody else, well, great. But if it doesn't, I'm okay. That's the part I never thought I'd say. I'm actually okay. Because for a long time, I thought being alone automatically meant failure. Now I think losing yourself is the real failure. And rebuilding yourself and protecting your mental peace, learning who you are again after years of emotional survival, That matters more to me right now than being in another relationship. So I don't have to say I'm single. And honestly, I think more people feel this way than they actually admit. Especially people over 50, who went through a divorce or a toxic relationship, betrayal or emotional abuse. A lot of people are exhausted. They're not bitter. There's a difference. And when you finally get your nervous system out of survival mode, you become very protective of that calm. That's where I'm at now. It's me and my fat headed old dog, Bruno. My life, my peace. And maybe someday I'll feel different. I'm open to that. But I'm no longer willing to sacrifice myself just to avoid being alone. I already did that once. And it cost me way too much. This is something that resonates with you. All of those stories are right here on my channel. Check them out.